There is a specific kind of person most of us have encountered, and if we are honest, most of us have been. The person who responds to every disruption immediately, who meets uncertainty with urgency, who fills every silence with action, every discomfort with reaction, every provocation with an answer delivered in real time, before the temperature has had even a moment to drop. This person is not fundamentally different from you or from anyone else. They are simply operating from an assumption so deeply embedded in modern culture that it rarely gets examined directly. The assumption that responding quickly is the same as responding well. That movement is the same as progress. That doing something, anything, is always preferable to the alternative, which is being still enough to actually understand what the situation requires before deciding what it requires of you. Carl Jung spent his career examining the specific costs of this assumption. He observed across decades of clinical work and personal reflection that the ego's compulsive need to act, to manage, to control, to respond, to do something about whatever is happening, was one of the primary mechanisms by which people cut themselves off from the deeper layer of their own intelligence. This observation was not simply theoretical for Jung. It was lived. During the period following his break with Freud, a period he described in his autobiography as one of profound disorientation and creative confusion, Jung deliberately chose not to force his way toward clarity through effortful intellectual activity. Instead, he waited. He played. He built things with his hands at the edge of the lake. He allowed what needed to emerge in its own time, without the ego's anxious management of the process. What emerged from this period of deliberate, patient non-forcing was the entire theoretical framework of analytical psychology. The shadow, the anima and animus, the self, the individuation process, the collective unconscious. Ideas that have shaped psychology and philosophy and literature for a century. They did not emerge through reactive urgency. They emerged through the specific quality of receptive, patient, unforced stillness that Jung chose when every cultural instinct around him would have pushed him toward defensive action, toward public argumentation, toward the performance of productivity that would have announced to the world that he was still relevant, still in control, still managing the situation. He chose none of these things. He chose to wait. And what arrived in the waiting changed everything. In the deeper strata of the psyche that do not communicate in the language of urgency, but in the language of the symbol, the body, the image, the felt sense, and the specific quality of insight that only arrives in conditions of genuine inner stillness. This video is about that deeper intelligence and about what it takes to access it. It is about the specific and counterintuitive relationship between calm and power, between stillness and change, between doing less and producing more of what actually matters. It will trace Jung's understanding of psychic energy and ego's role in either facilitating or blocking the flow of that energy through the Stoic philosophical tradition that provided so much of the conceptual scaffolding for Jung's own clinical observations, through the Daoist concept of Wu Wei, effortless action, which Jung studied carefully and considered one of the most psychologically sophisticated ideas in any philosophical tradition, through the mythological figures who embody calm as power, the still center from which genuine authority radiates, and through the neuroscience and psychology of emotional regulation that has confirmed, from an entirely different scientific direction, what Jung described clinically nearly a century ago. And we will arrive at a set of concrete, practically applicable practices for developing the specific quality of calm that is not passivity, not indifference, not the performance of serenity while anxiety churns invisibly underneath, but genuine psychological stillness, the kind that changes the rooms you enter, the relationships you have, and the outcomes you produce, not because you worked harder or reacted faster, But because you finally stopped doing the things that were generating the very chaos, you are trying to manage Jung's concept of psychic energy, which he called libido in the broad sense of general life force, rather than Freud's narrower sexual meaning, provides the theoretical foundation for understanding why calm functions as power rather than as weakness. Psychic energy, in Jung's framework, does not simply exist in the psyche. It flows, and the direction and quality of its flow determines almost everything about a person's effectiveness, their relationships, and their felt sense of aliveness. This flow can be directed consciously, through deliberate attention and chosen action, or it can be hijacked by the ego's anxiety-driven compulsion to react, manage, and control, in which case the energy is expended not in genuine productive action, but in the exhausting, circular activity of managing one's own nervous system's response to a perceived threat. The ego, in Jung's model, is the center of conscious awareness, and its function is genuinely important. It organizes the conscious personality, mediates between the inner and outer worlds, and provides the stable sense of continuous identity that makes coherent action possible. But the ego also has a characteristic weakness, a tendency to mistake its own anxious activity for productive engagement with reality, to confuse the feeling of urgency with the presence of genuine necessity, and to generate continuous reactive movement that looks, from the outside, like purposeful action, but that is actually, in Jung's terms, the ego's attempt to manage its own anxiety through the illusion of control. When the ego is running in this reactive mode, when it is generating continuous anxiety-driven activity in response to every disruption, uncertainty, or perceived threat, it does two things simultaneously that are both psychically costly. First, it expends an enormous quantity of psychic energy in activities that produce very little genuine result, the energy equivalent of spinning wheels, motion without traction. Second, and more importantly, it creates so much internal noise, such a continuous stream of anxious cognition, that the quieter signals from the deeper layers of the psyche, the signals Jung identified as carrying the most important and most genuinely useful information available, simply cannot be heard. The unconscious communicates in a quiet language, in the language of intuition, of felt sense, of the sudden and often unexpected clarity that comes not from effortful thinking, but from the specific quality of receptive stillness that effortful thinking makes impossible. This is not simply a metaphorical observation. The neuroscience of decision-making and cognitive function has documented the same dynamic with considerable precision. Research consistently shows that the brain's default mode network, the network of regions active during rest, mind-wandering, and internally directed thought, plays a critical role in insight, creativity, and the integration of complex information. The default mode network is suppressed when the brain is engaged in effortful, directed, reactive activity, which means that the specific neural processes most responsible for genuine insight and complex problem solving are actually inhibited by the state of continuous reactive urgency that modern culture tends to valorize as productivity. The person who is always responding, always managing, always doing something, is systematically suppressing the specific cognitive function most responsible for the quality of their responses, their management, and their doing. Jung intuited this a century before the neuroscience existed to confirm it. The research on stress and cognitive narrowing adds another important layer. When the nervous system registers a threat, whether physical or social, it activates a specific biological cascade that narrows the scope of attention, reduces the range of options the mind considers, and biases strongly toward familiar, previously learned responses rather than toward creative or nuanced ones. This is the classic fight or flight response, and it was adaptive in the ancestral environment for which it evolved, where the narrow focus it produced was often precisely what was needed. In the complex, relationship-dense, information-rich environment of modern life, however, this same narrowing is almost always counterproductive. The situations that generate the strongest urgency to react are almost always the ones that most require the expansive, nuanced, creative cognitive engagement that the stress response specifically inhibits. Calm, like keeping the nervous system below the activation threshold that triggers this narrowing, literally increases the cognitive range available for responding to exactly the situations that feel most urgent. The Stoic philosophical tradition, which Jung studied carefully, and which provides important conceptual background for understanding the relationship between calm and effective action, developed a framework that maps directly onto this dynamic. Epictetus, a former slave who became one of the most practically influential philosophers in the Western tradition, built his entire teaching around a single distinction that sounds simple and is genuinely transformative in practice. Some things are in our control, and some are not. The things in our control are our own judgments, our own impulses, our own desires and aversions. The things not in our control are literally everything else: other people's behavior, external events, the outcomes of our actions, what other people think of us, what happens to our bodies, and the vast majority of circumstances in which we find ourselves. The fundamental error of the reactive person in Epictetus's analysis is investing enormous psychic energy in attempting to control what is not in their control, while neglecting the development and mastery of the one domain that is genuinely theirs, their own inner response to whatever is happening. Marcus Aurelius, who kept his private philosophical notes in the document we now know as the Meditations, returned to this same theme with a consistency that suggests he found it genuinely difficult to maintain and genuinely important to keep remembering over and over in the private language of someone who is reminding themselves of something they know but keep forgetting to apply. He returns to the observation that the quality of his own inner response to events is the only thing he actually has any authority over, and that investing energy in anything else is a form of waste that the brevity of a human life simply cannot afford. He was, at the time of writing, the most powerful man in the Roman Empire, commanding armies, managing an empire under almost continuous military pressure, dealing with betrayal, incompetence, and natural disaster at a scale most people will never approach. And his private counsel to himself was not to act more decisively or respond more quickly. It was to be quieter, more deliberate, less reactive, more genuinely present with what was actually happening rather than with his own anxiety about what might happen. Seneca, whose letters to his friend Lucilius represent one of the most sustained practical explorations of Stoic philosophy ever written, makes the relationship between calm and effective action even more explicit. He observes that when we are swept by emotion into hasty reactions, we do not help ourselves or anyone else. We simply add our own turbulence to whatever turbulence was already present. The wise response to a difficult situation, for Seneca, is never to match its emotional intensity. It is to withdraw momentarily into the specific quality of inner stillness that allows one to see the situation clearly, rather than through the distorting lens of one's own reactive urgency. He notes with characteristic directness that a physician does not become sick in sympathy with their patient, and that we do not help those who are suffering by suffering alongside them in the same undirected, unconstructive way. What helps is the quality of calm, clear, genuinely steady presence that allows us to see what is actually needed and to provide it, rather than simply amplifying the existing anxiety with our own. The Daoist concept of Wu Wei, which translates approximately as non-action or effortless action, offers an Eastern philosophical parallel that Jung found particularly significant. Wu Wei does not mean doing nothing. It means acting from a place of genuine alignment with the nature of the situation rather than from the ego's anxious need to impose its own agenda. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi, returns repeatedly to the image of water as the model of this quality. Water does not force. It does not struggle. It does not resist what it cannot change. It simply moves according to its own nature, following the path of least resistance with an absolute consistency that, over time, produces effects more dramatic than any amount of forceful effort could achieve. Water carves the Grand Canyon not through force, but through patient, effortless, perfectly consistent movement according to its own nature. Jung read this image as a precise description of what genuinely effective psychological action looks like. Action that arises from alignment with the deeper nature of a situation rather than from the ego's anxious imposition of a predetermined strategy. The Zen Buddhist tradition develops a related principle through the concept of mushin, no mind, the state of consciousness that is fully present and fully responsive, without being caught in the reactive thinking that turns experience into threat management. The martial arts application of this principle is well documented but often misunderstood. Mushin is not the absence of awareness. It is the absence of the reactive categorizing, planning layer of thought that interposes itself between perception and response and introduces, in that interposition, a fraction of a second of delay and distortion that in a physical encounter can mean the difference between genuine responsiveness and mere reaction. In ordinary life, this same principle applies with even greater force. Because the delay and distortion introduced by the reactive layer are not fractions of a second, but days, weeks, months of decisions made from anxiety rather than clarity, responses generated from the need to manage one's own nervous system rather than from genuine perception of what the situation actually requires. This principle has a direct and immediately applicable dimension in the context of interpersonal relationships, and specifically in the context that the competitor material we examined was addressing, the relationship between a person's inner calm and their psychological authority in interactions with others. The competitor material observed something real and something that Jung's framework explains with considerable depth. That staying calm in situations designed to provoke a reaction generates a specific and powerful effect in the other person. But the competitor material framed this primarily as a strategy, a tactic for creating psychological leverage in a specific kind of difficult relationship dynamic. Jung's framework situates it in a much larger and more universally applicable context. Psychological calm is not a tactic. It is a state that develops through genuine inner work, and it communicates itself without effort and without performance, because it is not a performance. The person who has done sufficient individuation work, who has developed a genuine relationship with their own shadow material, who has worked through the specific anxieties and unexamined assumptions that generate reactive behavior, is calm not because they have decided to deploy calm as a strategy, but because their inner structure genuinely supports a quality of presence that anxiety-driven reactivity does not. This calm is not the same as the performed calm of someone suppressing a panic, though it can look identical from the outside. It carries a different quality, a groundedness, a specific sense of solidity that the people around such a person register at a level below conscious articulation. They simply feel, in the presence of this person, that something reliable is here. That something will not be easily moved. That there is no easy access to the reactive dynamic they may have been hoping to generate. Jung described this quality in his clinical observations of what he called the integrated personality, the person who has done sufficient individuation work to have developed a stable relationship with their own center. Such a person is not unaffected by the events around them. They feel things deeply, often more deeply than people who manage their responses through constant reactive movement, because genuine feeling requires the stillness to actually experience. what is present rather than immediately converting experience into reaction. But they are not governed by their feelings. They have developed what we might call emotional authority, the capacity to be fully present with their own emotional experience without being compelled to immediately act it out. And this capacity is precisely what generates the specific quality of presence that other people experience as genuinely powerful. Mythology has encoded this principle in some of its most enduring and most widely distributed images. The figure of the mountain appears across an enormous range of cultural traditions as the symbol of this quality, the thing that is wholly unmoved by the storms that pass over it, that receives lightning and wind and rain without being fundamentally altered by them, that maintains its own nature with such perfect consistency that everything else must eventually accommodate itself to it, rather than the reverse. The mountain does not fight the storm. It does not argue with the wind. It does not attempt to manage the weather. It simply is what it is, with such complete consistency and such complete solidity, that the storm, however dramatic its own performance, eventually passes, and the mountain remains not the figure of the judge in many legal and mythological traditions carries a related quality. The judge who is genuinely effective, genuinely authoritative, is not the one who reacts most strongly to the drama in the courtroom. It is the one who maintains, in the face of whatever drama unfolds, an absolute quality of calm that communicates, without any statement being required, that the drama will not be allowed to alter the fundamental character of the proceeding. The calmness is not passivity. It is a specific and active quality of presence that organizes everything around it simply by being consistently itself. The story of the Buddhas. Enlightenment under the Bodhi tree encodes this principle in one of its most dramatic and psychologically precise mythological forms. According to tradition, as the Buddha sat in meditation, approaching the moment of awakening, the demon Mara sent wave after wave of disturbance. Armies of monsters, storms of arrows, visions of desire and terror, all designed to drive the Buddha from his seat, to generate enough reactive urgency that the stillness required for awakening would be impossible to maintain. The Buddha's response to each wave of Mara's assault was not counterattack, not argument, not the performance of fearlessness. It was simply to touch the earth with one hand, the gesture known as Bhumi Sparsha Mudra, calling the earth itself to witness his right to be exactly where he was, doing exactly what he was doing, in exactly the quality of stillness he was maintaining. The earth bore witness. The storms passed. The awakening arrived. This myth encodes, with extraordinary precision, the specific dynamic we have been describing throughout this video. Genuine stillness is not achieved by defeating what would disturb it. It is achieved by being too completely itself to be genuinely disturbed. The ocean in still conditions carries another version of this image. The surface of the ocean in genuine calm reflects everything around it with perfect clarity, the sky, the clouds, the light. It is in this quality of stillness that the ocean reveals its full depth. When the surface is agitated, when waves and chop break up the surface, the reflective capacity is lost, and the depth becomes invisible. This is an image of what happens to genuine intelligence, to the deep intelligence Jung located in the unconscious, when the surface of the psyche is continuously agitated by reactive urgency. The depth is there always, but the agitation makes it invisible, makes it inaccessible, makes the surface a confusing distortion rather than a clear mirror of what is actually present. A concrete case study makes this dynamic visible in ordinary, professional, and relational terms. Consider two managers in the same organization, facing the same team crisis, the same unexpected failure of a major project. Manager A responds immediately and urgently, calling emergency meetings, generating visible intensity, expressing frustration, pushing everyone for immediate answers and immediate solutions. The activity is continuous and visible. Manager B receives the same news, sits with it briefly, asks a small number of genuinely precise questions, and then communicates to the team with a quality of calm that communicates something clearly without stating it directly. That this situation, however significant, is not beyond the capacity of this group to navigate, and that panic is not a required response. Research on leadership effectiveness consistently finds that teams led by the second manager type demonstrate not only better outcomes in the immediate crisis, but significantly higher resilience in subsequent challenges, precisely because the leader's calm has taught the team that calm is an available response to difficulty rather than a naive one. Jung would read this finding as a direct confirmation of the compensation principle at work in group dynamics. When a leader provides the quality of calm the group most urgently needs, the group is freed from the task of generating that quality itself, which would otherwise consume enormous collective psychic energy in exactly the anxiety-driven reactive behavior that produced such poor results in Manager A's team. The leader's calm does not mean nothing is happening. It means that what is happening is being met from a place of genuine stability rather than reactive urgency, which changes the quality of every subsequent action. Now, let's move from theoretical and mythological foundations into the concrete territory of how this quality is actually developed. Because it is not developed through deciding to be calm, which is roughly as effective as deciding to be tall. It is developed through specific practices that gradually change the underlying structure of the person's relationship to their own inner life, removing the specific anxieties and unexamined assumptions that generate reactive behavior and replacing them with something more genuinely stable. The first and most foundational practice is the deliberate cultivation of pause. Not the performative pause of someone counting to 10 while continuing to generate the same reactive cognitive activity, but the genuine pause that creates actual space between stimulus and response, in which the initial reactive impulse can be observed without being immediately acted upon. This practice begins at a very small scale. When something arrives that generates the impulse to respond immediately, whether a provocative message, an unexpected piece of bad news, a challenge to your position, practice waiting before responding. Not indefinitely, not as a power move, but long enough that the first reactive impulse has had time to clarify into something more considered. Even a delay of minutes, practiced consistently, begins to reveal the specific quality of your own reactive patterns with a clarity that immediate response makes impossible. The second practice is a specific form of shadow work, directed at the anxiety that drives reactive behavior. Most chronic reactivity is driven by a specific, often unexamined fear. The fear of what will happen if you do not respond immediately, if you do not manage this situation right now, if you let the moment pass without asserting your presence or your position. Examining this fear directly, asking honestly what specific outcome you believe will result from not reacting, and then examining whether that belief is accurate or whether it is the projection of an old anxiety onto a present situation that does not actually require it, is the specific inner work that begins to dissolve the compulsion at its root, rather than simply managing its expression. A useful journaling practice for this examination involves tracking, over several weeks, the specific situations that generate the strongest reactive urgency, noting not only what happened, but what specifically felt threatened in the moment. Not what you said or did in response, but what the reactive impulse was actually trying to protect. Over time, this tracking almost always reveals a remarkably consistent pattern. A small number of specific underlying anxieties, often rooted in experiences considerably older than the current situation, that are generating the majority of reactive behavior. This clarity is enormously useful. Not because naming the anxiety eliminates it, but because it allows you to recognize, the next time it arises, that you are dealing with a known pattern rather than with a genuinely novel and urgent threat, which changes the quality of available response from compulsive reaction to considered choice. The third practice involves what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold tension without forcing premature resolution. When you find yourself in a situation that generates the impulse to react, to resolve, to do something right now, try deliberately sitting with the tension for a period without resolving it in any direction. Allow the uncertainty to be present without immediately moving to eliminate it. This is genuinely uncomfortable for most people, especially for those whose reactive patterns are well established. But the capacity to hold tension without forcing resolution is precisely what allows the deeper intelligence of the unconscious to contribute its own perspective to a situation, which almost always arrives not in the urgency of the immediate reaction, but in the quieter, often slower, but considerably more insightful response that becomes available when the noise of reactivity has died down enough for the signal to be heard. The fourth practice is the cultivation of what might be called a regular solitude practice, a consistently protected period of unstructured internal time, free from the continuous inputs that modern life provides in almost unlimited quantities. Jung's own practice at Bollingen, his stone tower retreat on the shore of Lake Zurich, was essentially this: a structured withdrawal from the inputs of his professional and social life that allowed the deeper processes of his own psyche to run without interruption. You do not need a stone tower. You need a consistent, genuinely protected block of time, as little as 15 or 20 minutes daily, in which there is no agenda, no task to complete, no input to process, no performance to maintain. This is the specific condition in which the psyche's own organizing intelligence, the intelligence Jung located in the self rather than in the ego, most reliably makes itself available. The fifth practice is body-based, and it derives from Jung's insistence on the intimate connection between psyche and soma, between psychological and physical functioning. Chronic reactivity produces specific physical signatures: tension in the chest or throat, shallow breathing, a specific quality of held muscular tension, particularly in the shoulders, the jaw, and the hands. Developing a regular practice of noticing these physical signatures, not as problems to be immediately corrected, but as information about the current state of one's own inner life, creates a feedback system that allows the body's own intelligence to contribute to the regulation of reactive patterns. When you notice the physical signature of reactive urgency arising, the possibility of a conscious pause becomes available before the reactive behavior has fully committed itself to expression. The sixth and perhaps most transformative practice is the one that most directly applies to the interpersonal dimension of calm as power, the development of what might be called an inner reference point, a stable, consistently accessible sense of one's own center that does not depend on external validation or on the management of other people's responses for its stability. This is, in Jung's framework, the practical expression of the individuation process itself, the development of a self that is genuinely stable enough in its own nature that it is not easily destabilized by the ambient anxiety of others, not easily pulled into the reactive patterns that other people's behavior might seem to require, and not depending on the visible management of every situation for its own sense of security and competence. This quality cannot be performed. It cannot be faked convincingly for any extended period, because it is not a surface behavior, but a structural feature of the psyche, the result of genuine inner work done over genuine time. But it can be developed. It develops through every instance of choosing genuine pause over reactive urgency, through every honest examination of the specific anxiety driving a specific reactive impulse, through every period of protected solitude, through every instance of allowing tension to remain unresolved long, enough for something more considered than the first reaction to emerge. It develops gradually, the way the mountain became a mountain, through consistent, patient, largely invisible accretion over time. And as it develops, the specific quality of presence that Jung described in the integrated personality begins to become available, not as a performance, not as a strategy, but as a genuine and increasingly stable feature of who you actually are and how you actually meet the world. The specific promise of this video's title is worth addressing directly, because it may sound more like motivational language than like a psychological claim. Stay calm and watch everything change. What changes exactly? And why does calm produce change rather than simply maintaining a more comfortable version of an unchanged situation? What changes is, first and most immediately, the quality of your own decisions and actions. When the ego's anxiety-driven reactivity is no longer consuming the majority of available psychic energy, that energy becomes available for genuinely productive use. And the quality of the actions it generates is dramatically different from the quality of reactive actions. More considered, more accurately calibrated to the actual requirements of the situation. More capable of producing the outcomes that the reactive urgency was ostensibly trying to produce, but was actually preventing through its own interference. What changes? Second, is the dynamic of every significant relationship and interaction. The person who is genuinely calm does not generate the specific reactive dynamic that the anxiously reactive person generates in everyone around them. Calm is, in the most literal psychic sense, contagious. The person who brings genuine stillness into a room shifts the room's ambient emotional temperature simply by being present in it, not because they have done anything or said anything, but because the human nervous system is fundamentally a social organ that continuously reads and responds to the regulatory states of the people around it. And what changes third, and most profoundly, is the relationship between you and the deeper layers of your own intelligence. The unconscious does not deliver its most important communications to a psyche that is continuously generating reactive noise. It delivers them to a psyche that is quiet enough to hear something other than itself. Jung spent his career insisting that the most important guidance available to any human being is not the guidance of external authorities or of the ego's own anxious planning, but the guidance of the self, the organizing principle at the center of the whole psychic structure, which communicates through exactly the channels that reactive urgency closes down: dreams, intuition, synchronistic events, the unexpected clarity that sometimes arrives in the middle of an ordinary moment when the mind is quiet enough to notice it. These are the communications that change lives, and they are available to everyone. But they require, as their most basic condition, the specific quality of stillness that this video has been circling toward from its very first sentence. The next time you feel the pull of reactive urgency, the familiar pressure to respond, to manage, to do something right now about whatever is happening, try pausing long enough to ask a single question. Is this impulse coming from genuine clarity about what this situation requires, or is it coming from anxiety about what will happen if I do not act immediately? The answer to that question will not always be clear, and even when it is clear, acting on it rather than on the impulse will not always be easy. But the practice of asking it, consistently and honestly, is the beginning of the specific quality of psychological development that Jung spent his career making available to anyone willing to do the work. Not the reactive urgency that most people mistake for effectiveness, but the genuine, grounded, self-possessed calm that actually changes things. Not by fighting what is difficult, but by being in the face of it, so completely and so quietly itself that the difficulty has nothing to push against, and eventually, inevitably, moves on. Jung wrote, in one of the passages his students most often recalled, that the most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. He was not describing the calm of someone who has avoided difficulty. He was describing the calm of someone who has gone through it, fully and honestly, without the ego's management, and without the reactive patterns that most people use to keep the full weight of experience at a comfortable distance. That kind of calm is not a starting point. It is a destination. And every time you choose the pause over the reaction, the question over the assumption, the stillness over the noise, you take one small and genuine step toward it. Stay calm. Watch everything change.